Let me bring in Josh Marshall, editor and publisher of Talking Points Memo, and Michael Eric Dyson, professor at Georgetown University, author of The Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America. To Cory Booker's point, Josh, I mean, you know, I was going back through copies of, there's a book called Nixonland by our mutual friend Rick Perlstein, you know, about Nixon's campaign. I mean, what Donald Trump wants to do is run against Colin Kaepernick, Antifa, and undergraduates. I mean, it is absolute, and it's not just a thing on top of the thing he's doing.
Right.
While he's trying to get healthcare passed. It's the thing he's doing.
Oh, that's what he feels. Like healthcare, it's hard for me, when he talks about healthcare, it's hard for me to even think he's like lying about the policy, because I really don't think he knows even what is in these bills.
Or cares.
It's irrelevant to him. But this stuff really matters to him, and it really is primal with him. And you see the way he's your analogy about talk radio is exactly right, because he's zooming in on these
gets the feedback.
Yeah, these intense feelings. People, you know, look, people see wounded soldiers. It's horrifying. People feel admiration, they feel guilt, they feel the vicarious fear, and then he points at these people, the players. These people don't care.
Right.
They're making fun of it. They're not respecting it. That enrages people. And so he is a master at taking those feelings that have all sorts of, you know, positive and negative feelings and weaponizing them and turning them against his enemies. That's his politics.
So, Michael, I want to hear your response to this. So, when I say that he wants to run against Colin Kaepernick and Berkeley undergrads, right? Conservatives say yes, and the Democrats are going to give him exactly that. You idiots in the left, you know, speaking to people on Twitter or whatever, you're going to give him what he wants to fight about this. What do you make of that argument?
Well, you know, it's as with everything else with Trump, it's a confusion of means and ends. On the one hand, he wants to talk about, you know, the ability to have freedom of speech. On the other hand, when people exercise it peacefully, gesturally, symbolically, they are just disparaged. He calls people snowflakes and others who seek safe spaces on college campuses where they want to at least be protected in part from the vicious consequences of the exercise of free speech by right-wing bigots who then, you know, foment not only rhetorical resistance, but foment literal violence against the bodies of black or lesbian or gay students and so on. So the reality is, on the one hand, he does that, but on the other hand, he wants to make the entire country a safe space for his political ilk. So I think the irony here is, even as he attacks the identity politics and the politics of confusion on college campuses where he thinks political correctness is running amok, there is no more politically correct stance than to try to beat up on ball players and other people who are protesting their right to protest, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, than the President of the United States of America. This is the political correctness run amok.
There is also this sense that, I mean, first of all, we should note this. He's fundraising off it, right? So just in a literal sense, this is a fundraising that just got a stand. This is from Richard Painter, former Bush lawyer. Just got a standard email from POTUS with push-pull, ask for support. He's using our national anthem to raise cash. You know, there's also the fact that, like, I remember that first week. I remember reading you write about it when he said what he said about John McCain, which was just a shocking thing to say about a person. I mean, whatever your politics from any walk of life, like, I like people that don't get captured. What kind of thing is that to say? The ability for the people who support him in this fight to square that is kind of remarkable.
You know, I think with Trump, we get too hung up on the military and the flag. There's enemies and there's allies. There's his people and there's them, and that is the thing. I think his base, people who really support him, and he gets this about them, they know who the enemies are. They know who they are and who the other people are.
Right, and so it's not about the particularities of what you say about John McCain or what you say about the cons.
You know, because McCain was disrespecting Trump. That's all that matters.
Right. Michael, do you think... I wonder what you think about this in context of the news cycle we had a few weeks ago about, like, Trump dealing with Democrats, right? So there was like a mini news cycle where he makes a deal with the Democrats to extend the continuing resolution. And then you have this piece in the New York Times of him worried that the bipartisan deal hurts him with the base. The president deeply worried. His recent show of bipartisanship on the budget and DACA with two Democratic leaders endangers his standing with the base. How cynical or calculated do you think this is?
I mean, he wants his fake and eat it too. So he wants to be able to pretend on the one hand that he's, forging these connections with people reaching across the aisle. Remember, he used to beat up on Obama all the time for not even being interested in doing so. So he wants to make as he's doing that, but at the same time, he wants to deny the substance thereof. He doesn't want to really do it, because if he really does it, if there's a real consequence to sitting down with Pelosi and Schumer and getting a deal done, that then undercuts his legitimacy. But there's something else at stake here that we can never underestimate when it comes to Donald Trump. It is the centrality of narcissism. If I'm not the guy doing the thing, then it doesn't count. It doesn't make a difference because I didn't have a hand in doing it. If I don't see my reflection in the water is horrible. It has to be poured out, looking for the new, freshly, self-reflection that I can find. That's the central deal with Donald Trump, I think.
And there's something else, too, which is boredom. He made that deal with the Democrats. This is my favorite detail of that. He made the deal with the Democrats because the meeting was going too long. And he got bored and said, I don't want to hear about this anymore. Let's just do the 3 months. And what you are seeing right now, when you look at what he's tweeting about, he is bored by dealing with taxes or Cassie Graham or getting diesel fuel to the people of Puerto Rico.
Right.
This is what he finds not boring.
I think it's in that Times article that you referenced before that, and a lot of people have said this in the past, when things are calm, I mean, most of us in confrontation, that's unnerving. That's uncomfortable. We avoid confrontation.
Right.
When things are calm, he gets restless and he starts
to feel the feeling that other people feel in the midst of confrontation, which is that they're anxious and they need something to calm them. It's like our inverse.
Yeah, it's sort of like a bad guy who's like killing finger gets a little itchy, right? And they have to go after someone. I think that's what's really driving this.
Michael, do you think he is turning this issue? I feel like he's taking an issue that in the abstract would actually be a 60-40 issue in his favor for the reasons that Josh, I think, identified, right, in terms of people's broad brush feeling about the anthem and the flag.
Sure.
But I think because of the language he used and the people that he's attacked in the NFL, that he's actually managed to make it a 60-40 issue on the other side.
Well, absolutely right. And what he's done, in fact, is done a favor to those who oppose him by making explicit that which could only be implicit and therefore was difficult to get to.
Right.
In other words, it's a sophisticated argument to get to some of the more subtle, nuanced interpretations of the flag can never be readily identified only with veterans, that those veterans who are nonetheless heroic are not the exclusive bearers of a tradition of American heroism. That's a little bit more sophisticated and dynamic, but this guy has made it easy because he's gone after them with a kind of vulgarity and a kind of assault that really puts his heart right there on his sleeve, and people can see the ugliness for themselves.
Josh Marshall and Michael Eric Dyson, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.